Imagine witnessing an explosion so intense that it could illuminate the night sky miles away. In 1945, American scientists tested something never seen before: the first atomic bomb. This event not only marked the end of World War II, but also changed humanity's course forever. Did you know that some test witnesses were temporarily blinded just by observing the explosion from a long distance? In this video, we will dive into this fascinating and frightening story, full of secrets, scientific advances, and ethical dilemmas. Before we start, leave your like, sign up to the channel, and share this video with someone who loves history. Let us travel together to the day when the world saw the power of the atom for the first time. Chapter 1. The Historical Context. The 1940s was a period marked by intense global conflicts. World War II was at its height, and the world was witnessing an unprecedented arms race. After the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, the United States entered the war with full force, facing a dilemma: how to end a conflict that seemed endless. While soldiers fought on several fronts, behind the scenes, scientists worked frantically on a project so secret that few knew of its existence. It was the start of the race to create a game-changing weapon. The discovery of nuclear fission in 1938 by the German physicists Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann set off a red alert among the Allies. If knowledge were used to develop weapons, the consequences would be catastrophic. Concern grew even more when Albert Einstein and Leo Szilard wrote a letter to President Franklin D. Roosevelt, warning of the potential for a Nazi nuclear program. This was the spark that started the Manhattan Project, a joint effort of scientists and engineers to create the first atomic weapon. But before we got to the explosion of Trinity, it was necessary to overcome scientific, technological, and ethical challenges. Chapter 2. The Manhattan Project, the best-kept secret of the war. The Manhattan Project officially began in 1942, under a cloud of absolute secrecy. His name, apparently generic, was chosen to distract the curious and avoid suspicion. Coordinated by General Leslie Groves and scientifically led by J. Robert Oppenheimer, the project mobilized the greatest brains of the time and a colossal budget of $2 billion, something unimaginable in the midst of war. An operation on epic scale. More than 130,000 people were directly or indirectly involved in the project, spread out in secret facilities such as Los Alamos, Oak Ridge, and Hanford. To keep the secret, most of those involved knew only their part in the puzzle. Imagine working on something without knowing exactly what you were contributing to. The challenges were immense. Scientific advances. It was necessary to turn complex theories into practice. How to control a nuclear chain reaction without causing a catastrophe. Materials. Production. Enriching uranium and producing plutonium, the two essential elements for the bomb, were tasks that required large-scale innovation. Oppenheimer, nicknamed the father of the atomic bomb, not only oversaw the scientific aspects, but also dealt with deep moral issues. He knew that the creation of the bomb was a watershed in human history, but what really worried him was what came next. A calculated risk. Even with all the science and planning, there were uncertainties. Many feared that the initial explosion might trigger an uncontrolled reaction, igniting the atmosphere and destroying everything around. Still, the pressure to win the war and overcome the Nazis spoke louder. The project went ahead, and on July 16, 1945, in the New Mexico desert, everything was ready for the first nuclear test. This event would change the world forever. Chapter 3. The Trinity Test, the first nuclear mushroom. The morning of July 16, 1945, in the New Mexico desert began like any other hot summer day. But this would be a day that no one would ever forget. The name of the test, Trinity, was given by Oppenheimer, who drew inspiration from a poem by John Donne, symbolizing a new era of discovery and destruction. Preparations for the unimaginable. The scenario was set. A huge metal structure was built to support the bomb and the equipment needed to monitor the explosion. The area was isolated, but the event was of such magnitude that even those hundreds of miles away would be affected. The US government made sure that only a small part of the team was present. Most scientists and high-ranking officials watched from afar, safely, not knowing exactly what to expect. The bomb that would be detonated in the desert had a 20-kiloton load of TNT. In layman's terms, that meant an explosion 1,000 times more powerful than the Hiroshima bomb. But no one knew for sure what would happen. They had only their equations and their hopes. The test was about to reveal whether the whole research was worth it. The moment of truth. At 5:29 a.m., the bomb was detonated. What happened next is difficult to describe accurately. A glowing fireball of millions of degrees of temperature lit up the sky and expanded rapidly, turning the desert into a sea of heat and light. Observers, hundreds of miles away, reported seeing a glow so intense that many people became temporarily blind to the explosion. The sound was equally impressive. Some reported a deep, resounding crash, while others describe a shockwave that literally rocked the ground under their feet. For many, it was as if the world itself had been reshaped. The explosion was visible over hundreds of miles and felt even at great distances. But the Trinity test was not just a spectacle of destruction. For the scientists present, it was a confirmation that the Manhattan Project was on the right track. The theory had become reality, and the power of the atom, though still unknown in all its extent, had been released. Immediate reactions. After the explosion, a disturbing tension took hold of those present. The goal had been achieved, but what would follow? The Trinity explosion was not just a scientific milestone. It launched the world into a new era. An era in which humanity possessed a weapon of mass destruction that could change the course of any conflict, or even lead to the end of civilization itself. The scientists were elated, but also alarmed. Oppenheimer, in particular, reflected deeply on what had just happened. After the test, he quoted the words of an ancient Hindu text, "I am now death, the destroyer of worlds." For him, the creation of the atomic bomb represented not only a triumph of science, but also a profound moral dilemma. Chapter 4. Consequences and Reflections. The Trinity test was more than a scientific milestone. It was the harbinger of a new chapter in world history. The immediate impact of this explosion reverberated all over the globe, not only in the field of science, but also in politics, international relations, and human ethics. The end of World War II. Although the Trinity test took place in the middle of 1945, the real impact would only be felt on the battlefield. With the success of the bomb, the US was now in possession of a new kind of power. Shortly after, in August 1945, atomic bombs were dropped on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The explosions immediately killed tens of thousands of people, with many more dying in the weeks and months following due to radiation. These bombs marked the end of World War II, forcing Japan to surrender, but also initiated a period of deep reflection on the implications of such devastating power. Many questioned whether the use of these weapons was really necessary to end the war, while others argued that it was the only way to avoid a prolonged invasion and more deaths. In any case, the horrors caused by atomic bombs have forever changed the perception of war and mass destruction. The global impact. The nuclear age. The world was not the same after 1945. Nuclear power was no longer an abstract concept or a future threat. It had already been realized in a human tragedy. But at the same time, the Trinity test and the use of atomic bombs showed the capacity of science to transform war, and opened a new field for research in nuclear energy, which would later have both peaceful and military applications. The bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki unleashed a wave of ethical and moral reflection, not only among scientists, but also among the world's population. It was impossible to ignore the destructive power that the atom now represented. Many feared that the world was on the brink of a new era of nuclear wars. tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union increased, giving rise to the Cold War, an arms race that would lead to the development of even more powerful nuclear arsenals. The moral doubt scientists involved in the Manhattan Project, like Oppenheimer and many of his colleagues, have begun to question their own actions. They had contributed to the creation of a weapon that could literally destroy the world. Oppenheimer, especially, would become a symbol of the internal struggle between scientific advancement and the moral implications of his discoveries. His famous quote after the test, "I am now death, the destroyer of worlds," resonated as an echo of the responsibility they bore. Chapter 5. The Legacy of the Atomic Age. After the Trinity test and the explosions in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the world entered a new era, the nuclear age. The destructive power of atomic weapons not only reconfigured the dynamics of international relations, but also profoundly affected global politics, science, and ethics, casting a shadow that persists to this day. The arms race and the Cold War. With the dominance of nuclear energy, the United States became the first nation to possess an atomic bomb. However, this supremacy did not last long. The Soviet Union, in 1949, tested its own nuclear bomb, starting the dreaded arms race of the Cold War. The two superpowers, USA and USSR, engaged in an ideological and military dispute, each trying to keep control over the development of nuclear weapons. During the following decades, the world was involved in a dangerous game of mutual assured destruction, in which both superpowers had nuclear arsenals so large that any nuclear conflict could mean the end of civilization as we know it. The development of more powerful atomic bombs, such as the hydrogen bomb, and nuclear tests conducted in various parts of the world, have amplified the fear of an imminent nuclear apocalypse. Although direct confrontation between the two powers was avoided, the risk of a nuclear war has never been more real. The scientific and technological impact. While global politics and security were dominated by the threat of nuclear war, the field of nuclear science advanced. Nuclear power, which initially generated so much fear, began to be seen as a potential solution to the world's growing demand for energy. In the following years, nuclear energy began to be used to generate electricity in nuclear power plants, with the aim of providing a more efficient and low-cost source of energy. However, nuclear disasters such as Chernobyl, 1986, and Fukushima, 2011, continued to fuel the debate about the risks of this technology. The discovery of atomic power has also boosted scientific advances in other areas, including medicine, with the use of radiation for cancer treatment, and the use of nuclear techniques to track and diagnose diseases. Even so, the peaceful use of nuclear energy has never succeeded in extinguishing the fear of destruction caused by atomic weapons. The ethical debate. Where can science go? Over time, the use of the atomic bomb and the discovery of its immense destructive power provoked a global ethical debate. Was it moral to create a weapon so powerful that could annihilate an entire city in seconds? The history of the Trinity test, the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the nuclear legacy that followed raise fundamental questions about the responsibility of scientists and governments in developing technologies for mass destruction. Many scientists who participated in the Manhattan Project regretted their contribution to the creation of the bomb. Oppenheimer, for example, had an ambivalent relationship with his work. He knew that his findings could be used for good or evil, and his famous quote reflected the weight of his own guilt. In a moment of reflection, he said, "I am now death, the destroyer of worlds," recognizing that by giving birth to this new force, he had irreversibly changed the history of mankind. The future. The threat of a nuclear world today. The threat of nuclear conflict still looms over humanity. Although international treaties, such as the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, NPT, have been implemented to limit the spread of nuclear weapons, there are still tens of thousands of nuclear warheads in the world, with several countries maintaining nuclear arsenals on standby. The nuclear issue remains one of the most urgent and complex issues of our time. The risk of a full-blown nuclear war may have diminished since the end of the Cold War, but the possibility of nuclear conflicts is still a constant reality, especially with the emergence of new nuclear powers and geopolitical tensions in various regions of the world. The legacy of the Trinity test is therefore not only a landmark in scientific and military history, but a constant reminder of humanity's destructive power and the ethical responsibility that accompanies this power. The great lesson that the world must learn from this story is that while science has the power to transform the world, it also carries a moral weight that should be considered in all its discoveries. The Trinity test and the use of atomic bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki changed the course of history. These explosions not only marked the end of World War II, but also ushered in the nuclear age with its advances and ethical dilemmas. The lesson we can draw from this dark chapter of history is the need for reflection on the use of scientific and technological power. The world continues to struggle with the questions left by this invention and the challenges it poses for future generations. Understanding what happened on that fateful day in 1945, we are challenged to think about how we can avoid a future in which nuclear power is used irreversibly and destructively. After all, the Trinity test was a moment of great discovery, but also a warning. Absolute power demands responsibility.